Hi. Hi.
All right. So let's get going. Special education. So I'm going to just sort of go through what I hope to cover. Now that we have an hour, this is a little ambitious, but I'm going to do my best. We're going to talk about the difference between IEPs and 504 plans. We're going to talk about evaluations. What are they? How do you get one? Why might you want to get one? And what is going on with evaluations during the pandemic? We're going to talk about an initial eligibility meeting. So after a first evaluation, how do you prepare for that? And what to do if you don't agree with the evaluation. Going to talk about what's in an IEP. Very briefly, going to touch on school discipline for kids with disabilities. Going to talk about a new thing called COVID compensatory services. And then we're going to touch on in-person services, remote learning, and the pandemic. Ooh. And I clicked too fast. I'm so sorry. The last thing is what to do when you and the school disagree. Okay, let's go for it. So the first slide, this is about who is eligible for an IEP. An IEP stands for an individualized educational plan, and it is from a federal law that means a law that covers the entire United States of America. And the law says that students with disabilities are entitled to what we call a free and appropriate special education. And that means that kids with disabilities are entitled to make meaningful progress in school year over year over year. That's not just getting passing grades and moving from grade to grade. It's real meaningful progress. So this is a law that's supposed to protect our kids with disabilities. So the first step is student has to have a disability. Then we have to conclude that the student isn't making effective progress in school. We have to agree that the student's disability is what's causing the lack of effective progress. And we have to agree that the student needs specially designed instruction or related services. Specially designed instruction basically means that a student needs to be taught in a very specific way in order for them to understand the academic material. I'm going to go over some more examples of that in a minute. Related services, these are things like counseling, occupational therapy, specialized reading support. Those are sort of related services that a student might get in addition to their regular instruction. So that is what groups of students are eligible to get IEPs. So do we have questions about that? Chat is popping, but it looks like all of these questions are answered. All right. So now we're going to talk about what an IEP entitles a student to. Entitled means this is a thing that a student has a right to under the law. The big banner headline is a free and appropriate public education. You might remember just 20 seconds ago, I said that the law entitles kids to a free and appropriate public education. A free and appropriate public education has a couple of parts. One part is specially designed instruction. So these are things like a rules-based reading program. That means a very specific way that some kids with learning disabilities need to learn how to read. It might be inclusion math support. So maybe we have a child who's in like a big classroom, 25 kids, but that student needs a special education teacher to come work with them specifically during math so that they can be a part of the general classroom. It could be language-based instruction, which is another very specific way that some kids with learning disabilities need to learn. That's one part, specially designed instruction. Another part are accommodations. These are things where the school just kind of has to change some things at the margins, on the edges, to help students be successful. So this might be something like extra time. Like maybe we have a student who has anxiety. And so that means that when they open a test, if they get to a question they don't know, they feel panicked. And so they need some time to go calm down. It's okay. Do some coping skills and then come back to the test. So that student needs some extra time on the test. Another example is chunking material. This is like, for me, if I look at a big list of everything that I have to do in a day, I melt into a puddle on my floor. So instead, I just look at the first thing on my list and I go step by step by step. There are some students who need that too. So we break things down so that they can do one at a time. Next, we do preferential seating. It's another example of an accommodation. Maybe we need a student to sit very close to the teacher, or maybe a student needs to be far from a window because they can get distracted, or maybe a student needs to sit close to a window so they don't feel trapped. Those are examples of some accommodations. Next, we have related services. So related services are things where typically it's other providers, typically not special education teachers, and they come in or pull the student out of their classroom to give them some kind of extra support. That could be something like counseling. That could be something like a BCBA. BCBAs, are a certain kind of service provider that sometimes help kids, but also sometimes help teachers who are struggling. Maybe we have a kid who doesn't need a BCBA or an AB, sometimes called ABA, Applied Behavioral Analysis. Maybe that's not a therapy that the student needs themselves, but the teacher who is working with the student does need some support around ABA in order to best serve the student. That would be a related service. Or something like occupational therapy. Those are all just a couple of examples of what those look like. Let's see if we have some questions.
Liz, yes, I was going to say, we start with Sarah's question. Is it true that reading/math specialists are only available for special education students? This is what we were told starting 4th grade.
Interesting. I would say that legally, there's no reason why a reading or math specialist would be only available to a special education student, meaning someone with an IEP. It may be the case that there's something going on where a school says, this reading specialist is assigned to work with kid A. And if this reading specialist doesn't work with kid A, we're going to get in trouble with kid A's parents. So we can't have it going with kid B. That could be what the school is thinking, but certainly there's no reason that a reading or math specialist can't work with students with disabilities, students with IEPs. I will say that part of the reason IEPs are so important is that if your student doesn't have an IEP or a 504 plan, which we'll talk about in 1 minute, if they don't have an IEP or a 504 plan, then there's no way for you to hold the district legally accountable to provide a reading or math specialist. So let's say, for example, your child doesn't have a disability, but is struggling a little bit in reading, and you want them to get some extra reading help. Unless your student is found eligible for an IEP or 504 plan, the district is not legally obligated to give your child that help. They may choose to. The student's teacher may say, yeah, this kiddo needs some extra reading help. Let's give that to her. But they're not legally obligated to.
Thank you.
Sarah said, absolutely. Nicole has a question. What is preferential seating supposed to look like in remote learning? What a good question. Nicole, if you find out an answer to that, I would love to know. I do not think I think that is something that is challenging. I think that the way some schools have interpreted or thought about it is by providing breakout rooms So for example, if a student needs to be seated near the teacher, then they're not going to be able to literally be seated near a teacher in at least Zoom or Google Classroom. But maybe it means that there's a teacher who is sort of keeping a closer eye on that child throughout the class so that they can chat them or pull them into a breakout room or something like that if something starts to be challenging. Someone has a question. Is reading with a specialist a related service if a student gets pulled out of class? Sure. A related service is really just a service that a student gets that isn't sort of a very direct, specially designed instruction. Okay. I think that's all of our questions. So let's keep going. Now, all of those things that I just talked about, specially designed instruction, how kids get taught, related services, the services that they need, and accommodations, the things that a school has to change in order to support that student, those all have to be placed in, those all have to happen in what lawyers call the least, oh goodness, I have a typo. I have used this PowerPoint probably 150 times, and I have never noticed this typo before. Oh, okay. It's supposed to say the least restrictive environment, not the least restorative environment. I don't know what that means. I'm so sorry. But the least restrictive environment. And least restrictive environment is about getting kids as close to the general education classroom as we can, where they're still making progress towards their goals. This is really about, you know, in the mid 20th century, schools and districts across the country unfortunately really segregated students with disabilities in separate classrooms. Those kids were not able to access the curriculum. Everything became much, much more challenging for them. And Congress, one of the ways in which Congress intervened was to say, no, we're not going to segregate kids with disabilities into their own classrooms. We're going to say that schools have to put kids as close to the general education classroom as you can get them, where they're still making progress. So this means we're going to talk about placement, the type of classroom and school that a child is learning in. So on the one hand, this is sort of on a scale. If we were in person, I would have like a nice whiteboard behind me, but I don't. So on the one end, we have a general education classroom. A general education classroom is, you know, think of it as 25 kids and a teacher. The next sort of step up from a general education classroom is what is sometimes called an inclusion classroom. Inclusion is sort of a tricky word because people say it and they mean all kinds of different things. I'm going to tell you what I think is a model for a really good inclusion classroom. So an inclusion classroom, a good one, is typically co-taught. So that means there's a general education teacher and a special education teacher. And both teachers work together to teach the whole classroom. We wanted to have slightly fewer kids, and typically about a third of those students in that classroom have IEPs. The rest of the students typically do not. So this is a classroom where some kids have disabilities, some kids don't. Special education teachers and general education teachers work together to include, hence the name, all the students in learning. Then we have a step up from that, which is called partial inclusion. This is when the student is in that type of classroom for some of the day, but is also in a smaller classroom for other parts of the day. So now we're going to talk about what the smaller classroom is. The smaller classroom is called a substantially separate classroom. So this is a classroom that is much smaller, typically, you know, maybe 7, 8, 9, 10, at the most 12 students, very few kids, all kids with disabilities. So unlike inclusion, where only about a third of the kids there have disabilities, in a substantially separate classroom, all of the students typically have disabilities. All of them. And in Boston, in BPS, they typically have the same type of disability. In these classrooms, there's usually a special education teacher and a paraprofessional or a teacher's aide, sometimes 2 paraprofessionals. And this substantially separate classroom, these are, you know, in Boston, if you have kids who are in like a therapeutic learning classroom or a lab, that's this kind of classroom. Then the step up from that is a day school. Day schools can be run by a public school district, or they can be run by private entities. A day school is, think of it like a building full of substantially separate classrooms. So the whole building is just those smaller classes. In Boston, the public day schools, so the schools that are run by the school district, are the Carter, the Horseman, and the McKinley schools. And then there are many private day schools across, you know, greater Boston. Then sort of the last slot here are residential schools. Residential schools are like day schools. They're privately run, but they are, students live there. So they live there and they go to school there. So that, and what the law says is you have to place a student as close to the general education classroom as you can get, where that student is still making progress. That's what at least restrictive, not least restive environment means. So all of those things, specially designed instruction, accommodations, and related services happen in the least restrictive environment. And let's see what classrooms that we have, or classrooms, questions.
Hannah's question is the district legally required just to provide the services in the IEP, or to also do something more or different at the services in the IEP plan aren't achieving effective learning? And what happens when a student isn't advancing in their IEP measurable goals at all?
Yeah, so basically the question is, if a student has an IEP and the district is doing what's in the IEP, let's say, and it's not working, what does the district just keep doing what's in the IEP? The answer is no, that is not what the district should be doing. If a student is not making any progress towards their goals, what the district should do, the first thing, is reconvene the IEP team. So that means you, the caregiver, and maybe the student, depending on the student's age, any outside providers you have, like a therapist or a counselor or anybody like that. Bring all those folks together and talk about what's going on. Why isn't the student making progress? What are we doing? What have we not provided this student that they need? It may be that during that meeting that the IEP team thinks, okay, we don't know what this student needs. We know what we're doing now isn't working, but we don't know what they actually need. If that's the case, then what the team is likely going to need to do is a reevaluation. We're going to talk about evaluations shortly, but a reevaluation where they try and find out what does the student need, and then rewrite the IEP to include the recommendations of those evaluators. So that's what should happen. Bring the team back together, figure out what the student needs, give it to them. Lisa asks, what is the number of students that should be in a general education inclusion classroom? So if we're talking about those co-taught inclusion classrooms, I think Boston tries to keep them around like 18 is what I've heard is a good number. That's what I've heard.
Brian, could we go beyond heard? And Brian, could you tell us what that number is? Let me find you.
Yeah, if there's I don't know.
I can't unmute him. I need one of my hosts to unmute Brian White, please, so he can answer. Can you throw the answer in the chat, Brian, for me? What that number is?
Okay.
I just can have the question repeated, and then I'll be able to answer it as soon as I hear it.
Brian, the question was just, go for it, Roxy.
What is the number of students that should be in a general ed inclusion class? So what's the maximum number of children in an inclusion class?
The maximum number. So the maximum.
They're talking about like a co-taught inclusion classroom.
So there is multiple different, thanks Elizabeth, there's multiple different inclusion models within the district. If it is a typical model where the district, a typical model would be no more than 20 students.
Hello.
No more than, yes, Leonardo, with no more than 5 students on an IEP. There are a select number of schools that may have 6.
So that, I hope that answers your question, Lisa. I think it should. Mayu asks, will a 504 plan be evaluated during the remote classes while there's COVID-19? Mayu, can you put in the chat if you mean, will a 504 plan be followed? Or do you mean, will schools think about whether or not a 504 plan is working?
Hello.
If you could just clarify your question in the chat, I'll answer it.
Liz, could you answer both questions? Is the district
Sure.
creating 504 plans
Sure.
currently, and are they adhering to them?
Yes. So the district should be following 504 plans even during this period of remote learning. And if a 504 plan is not working during this period of remote learning, then the district should be having a meeting, talking about why it isn't working, and considering reevaluating the student. Courtney asks, doesn't the substantially separate classroom contradict the very principle of inclusion and non-segregation? This is my favorite thing to talk about. Yes, it does. Substantially separate classrooms contradict the principle of inclusion. I think that there are some kids who will tell you that that smaller classroom, especially at certain grades, is helpful for them. But it's my opinion that if we had unlimited funding, the vast majority of kids in substantially separate classrooms in Boston could be educated in inclusion classrooms or private day schools. Nicole has a question about independent evaluations. Nicole, we are going to get to independent evaluations. When we get there, if I don't answer your question, please put in the chat, Elizabeth, you did not answer my question, despite promising to do so, and I will answer it then. Oh, and Chris Panarisi is here and also answered the inclusion question. Thank you, Chris. Okay. I think those are all the questions we have right now. So I'm going to pause because we're now briefly going to touch on 504 plans and the difference between an IEP and a 504 plan. So remember I said that an IEP—
If I may, I just want to address Latia's concern, a question about, are there any concerns that inclusion classrooms, for lack of better terms, hold back regular ed students as instruction may be at a slower pace due to mixed level of need in the class? And I know that there are research studies that clearly show that it actually, having a mixture will improve the quality of instruction, because no matter inclusion or a disability or a student on IEP does not mean that things automatically have to be slowed down to paces. That's not an automatic thing like that. But
I think,
Liz, I'll let you.
Yeah, I think you're right on, Roxy. And Latia, I'm so sorry that I missed your question, my first read through. Yeah, we have lots of research. There's actually been research even specific to Boston about this. And there's no reason to think that instruction and inclusion classrooms happens at any sort of slower pace than sort of general education students. I'll also say, you know, I represent a lot of kids who are incredibly gifted academically and, you know, can fly ahead of the class. They just need some support around autism, around, you know, really difficult things that they've witnessed. But those kids are real gifts to a classroom. And I don't think there's any reason to think that that slows anything down. Did you want to add anything, Roxy? Okay.
No, that's perfect. Thank you.
Absolutely. So a 504 plan, what I was going to say is, if you remember at the beginning, we talked about when a student gets an IEP. And you'll remember we said that a student gets an IEP when they have a disability, they're not making effective progress at school, they're not making effective progress because of their disability, and they need the specially designed instruction and related services. So if a student does have a disability, but is making progress, that student may qualify for a 504 plan. 504 plans are from a part of countrywide, the federal law, that is about anti-discrimination. So as opposed to the law that created IEPs that said students with disabilities are entitled to this free and appropriate public education, 504 plans come from a part of the law that says you can't discriminate against kids with disabilities. So 504 plans are typically going to be more about just that accommodation section, maybe the related services sometimes, but they're not going to be about the specially designed instruction. That's a very, very, very quick 504 plan IEP distinction. There's some more nuance to it, but I think I'll leave it there for now. If folks have more specific questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. Okay, now we're going to talk about evaluations. What's up with evaluations? This is a list. Obviously, I love lists. This is a list of different types of evaluations that schools, districts, and other evaluators can do. You'll see that it covers a huge variety of things that could be going on for a student. So for example, it covers a psychological evaluation. That's something that might pick up a student having trouble making friends, or a student who becomes really upset at school sometimes. There's speech and language. There's something called a functional behavior assessment. And the idea behind a functional behavioral assessment is it says, okay, people behave in certain ways for a reason. They're not doing it for no reason. So what a functional behavioral assessment does is it looks at a student's behavior, and then it looks at what happens right before and right after. And it says, okay, let's us, the adults, stop doing those things that we're doing right before the student's behavior or right after the student's behavior, with the idea that hopefully that will stop specific behavior. There's something called a transition assessment. This looks at what kids who are a little bit older in high school might need in order to transition into post-secondary school or a career. And a whole bunch of different kinds of evaluations and assessments can be done. The point of an evaluation is to identify a student's disability and whether that student is making progress. It's important to know that these evaluations do not diagnose students. Your school should not be evaluating your child and saying, okay, your child has ADHD. What they do instead is there are a whole bunch of categories that the law creates, a whole bunch of different kinds of categories of disabilities. And the evaluations say, okay, do we think this child fits into one of these categories? And I will say, as an aside, this is a horrible way to talk about kids, is which categories do they fit in? I recognize that. I know there are a lot, I'm sure everyone on the call recognizes that. I'm talking that way because that is what the law looks at. And that's sort of the route we have to go in order to get kids services that they need. So in addition to identifying the student's disability, whether or not a student's making progress, the evaluations will also suggest some recommendations that might help the student. So those evaluations might say that a student needs a smaller, they might say a student needs more individualized attention. They might say that a student needs a social skills group where they can practice with other peers. They might say that a student, really needs individualized reading instruction. Those are the kinds of recommendations that you can get from an evaluation. Okay, let's see what questions we have here. Okay, so we have one question from the Spanish interpreter. And the question is, can an IEP help with all of a student's needs across all subjects, or can it help with just one subject? The answer is it can help with all subjects. We'll talk more about that in a bit, but all subjects. And I also see some requests for my contact info. I will drop that in the chat at the end. It's also in the PowerPoint on the last slide. Sarah has a question about where ADHD fits into these categories. So I actually we had a slide that goes through all the categories, but in the interest of time, I cut it. I'll say ADHD is typically slotted into what's called the health impairment. We have a question. Can you share some examples of services that are 504 eligible? So it depends on the student and it depends on the specific evaluation and the situation of a student. I will say like counseling, for example, can be included in a 504 plan. Latia has a question. Are these evaluations paid for by health insurance? No, these evaluations are paid for by the school district. You can also go get different kinds of evaluations from healthcare providers, but these evaluations are all paid for by the school district. Nicole, this is not where your evaluation question will be answered, but I appreciate you keeping me honest. Okay. I think those are all the questions that we have so far. Okay. So now we are going to talk about evaluations and a timeline. So the first thing to know is there's an evaluation referral. Here's the thing about referring a student for special education. If you were just like a person walking around in the world and you had a 4-year-old and your 4-year-old was having a little bit of trouble, you would not know that there was this magic thing in the world called special education and that you should go ask for a special education evaluation, because how would you know that? You're just going around in the world. So the law says, school districts, you know what special education is. So we are going to put the burden on you to identify kids who might need an evaluation for special education. So that's called child find. And that means that the district should be identifying kids who might need special education evaluations. But anyone can refer a student for an evaluation. That means a student's pediatrician can say, I think this kid needs a special education evaluation. It means the child's counselor could say it, the child's teacher. It means the receptionist at the school. It means the parent. Truly, anyone who knows the kid can say, I think this child needs this evaluation. If it is you, the parent, who thinks that this child needs a special education evaluation, technically, you do not have to say any magic words and it does not have to be in writing, but in the interest of creating a record, lawyers love things that are written down. I'm going to encourage you to do it in writing. If you can do it in email, that's great. If you want to write it down, also fine. If at all possible, if you can get something back from the school that says, yep, we received it, here's the date, that's great. That's not always possible, but it's very helpful. All you have to say when you're requesting this is, I, parent, want a special education evaluation for my student so-and-so because I am worried about their reading or their math or their whatever it is that you're worried about. That's all you have to do. Within 5 school days, the school should send a consent form to you, the parent. That's because if you think about, if your kid's teacher says, I think this student needs a special education evaluation, the school can't just start that. They have to get permission from you, the parent, first. So they're going to send you a consent form. The consent form should be in the language that you prefer. And it should list all of the evaluations. Remember that long list? It should list all the evaluations that the school wants to do and thinks would be helpful. Once the school gets that signed consent form, the school must complete all the evaluations within 30 school days of receiving the signed consent form. I know that there are many of you who are like, but it's a pandemic, what are we doing? We'll talk about it in a minute. Just know the law says 30 school days. Schools must hold IEP meetings to discuss evaluations and provide proposed IEPs within 45 school days of receiving that signed consent form. So the big numbers to know are you have to get the consent form within 5 school days, complete the evaluations within 30 school days, and then can hold the meeting within 45 school days. A good thing to know is I've sometimes heard from families that sometimes schools say things like, we don't think your child needs an evaluation, or are you sure, or different things like that. Please know that a school should not be doing that. If you want your child to be evaluated, your child gets evaluated. That doesn't necessarily mean your child will be found eligible, but if you request an evaluation, the school needs to do it. Okay, let's see if we have questions here. We have a question. Kristen, we will get to the BPS, the remote issue in 1 second. Brian answered that. Okay, great. Just blazing through here. Okay, so evaluations, what about the pandemic? First thing to know is that the state has said that those timelines that I mentioned, the 5 days, the 30 days, the 45 days, they're still in effect. There's no pandemic pause button for special education law. So those timelines still count. Schools should do in-person evaluations if feasible, if possible, even if school buildings are closed. This is guidance from the state. If feasible to conduct evaluations remotely, schools may conduct them remotely. So I'll tell you, here's what I'm suggesting that families do if you have a child who has a pending evaluation. I suggest, remember that consent form that we talked about? Look at the consent form and look at all the different evaluations. And the first question can be, could this evaluation be done in person? Now, there are some families for whom in-person evaluations, even with various precautions, are not going to be safe. And I understand and respect that. So, but the first thing is, are there any of these evaluations that could safely be done in person? If not, can they be done remotely? There are some evaluations and assessments that can be done remotely. For example, there are some evaluations that are basically parent surveys. Certainly a school can mail a parent a survey, have them fill it out and mail it back. But can we evaluate an autistic 4-year-old over Zoom? Probably not. So those are the 2 questions. Going through the evaluations and saying, can they be done in person? Can they be done remotely? This is a really tough area. I will say with Boston specifically, the evaluation backlog continues to be a big problem. There are many families who are still awaiting evaluations from when schools were closed back in the spring and the summer because of the pandemic. So this is a tough one. I think that the best thing that families can do is to try and identify with Boston, if the school's saying like, we just can't do this evaluation right now, is to say, can it be done in person? If not, what here can be done remotely? At a city council meeting tonight, folks from Boston told the city council that they were working on this backlog and that they anticipated to have a plan by the middle of next week, saying when the evaluation backlog would be completed. So hopefully some of this will get better. But evaluations are tough right now. Kelly has a question. If the parent doesn't feel comfortable bringing the child to the testing site for an evaluation, what accommodations will be provided? I think that would require more questions, Callie. So if the parent doesn't feel comfortable bringing the child to a testing site, like, why, what's going on? Is it a disability related to the parent? Is it a disability related to the child? Are there other options for where the evaluation could be completed? So I think those questions would all have to be answered. If it's for a specific family, you're welcome to shoot me an email. Anna has a question. Can evaluations from outside certified organizations be submitted in these unusual circumstances? So we will get to outside independent evaluations, Anna, I promise. We'll try. We will. It'll just be typed. Cheryl has a question. So that is a very reasonable question, which is basically, so if Boston has, a significant backlog of thousands of evaluations that have not been done in the time frame, but the timelines are still in effect, what do we do about that? I think what we do about that is something called COVID compensatory services. And we will get to that.
If I may just jump in for a moment, Liz.
Please.
Brian, could you address the question, which is not really a Liz question, as far as if a parent doesn't feel safe bringing their child for evaluation at a testing center, so I'm going to assume this may be, it could be preschool going into BPS, what for safety reasons, what were the options for that?
Sure. I actually just dropped it in the chat as you were talking. And so I hit enter by accident before I was done. So if it's in the chat, and then I can also share from that. So first, it would be, just as Elizabeth said, I have some follow-up questions because there are times when individuals or circumstances that individuals are under where we can be creative. However, that always has to start at the school-based level. So currently, with the safety measures in place, there are opportunities for students to have direct assessments done. In fact, I know that there was assessments done at the Manning earlier this week. So there are assessments being done. There were also assessments being done in person at the Beethoven, which are done through BPS and BTU collaboration. And they're also done not by, we're trying.
So not to interrupt Byron, but basically the gist of that honestly is that once they work at the school level, the school can work to creatively figure out there's a way to assess the child in a space or area that may feel safe for that particular family and work with them on their individual needs, but they will still attempt to make accommodations to do the assessment.
We will try to work with the family as much as we can, just as we are trying to work with the family, as we discuss what the remote learning plan would look like, what the COVID compensatory service plan will look like, that Elizabeth is about to go over. So as with everything with your child, the school-based team knows them the best, and they would be helping and partnering with you to ensure that whatever needs to happen moving forward will be done so that everyone is safe.
Callie,
thank you.
I can see you have a
talk
question.
to Brian offline also, because she's saying something else. She was told something differently, because there's a difference. That's a personal comfort level, because like I'm comfortable going into schools, but it's a personal comfort level. And I think that the point is to individually on that one-to-one basis, especially when if it's a new student, then I forget her name, Mary, but especially if it's coming from early intervention, the person that's coordinating the IEP team, that is who you would speak with to make sure you can make those arrangements for what's comfortable. Because I would hope when you include working with families, it may mean that it's not at a school building, it could be at a community space or something, or it may be not right now if they're saying I don't feel comfortable with anything at all. But it would have to be on a very case-by-case basis, because not every single school in the entire Boston district is an unsafe space per se. So it would have to be tailored.
So Nicole and Callie, I think, so for your individual kids, I'm going to encourage you to just give me a call, talk about what's going on with that evaluation. You're not alone. There have been a lot of difficult situations with evaluations since March. So, with regard to your specific kid, this is sort of what I mentioned at the beginning. If you've got a question about your specific kid, please, I just dropped my information in the chat. It's also on the slides, but just so you have it, you're welcome to give us a call.
Just to follow up with that, Elizabeth, first, if there is a problem or you have any questions regarding the evaluation process, please connect with your COS at the school or the coordinator of the school. If they are unable to be reached, please then contact either myself or one of my colleagues.
Ryan, because I think, thank you so much. That's covered. Can you just the question from Sarah is about what are the testing sites now that the schools are closed?
We are working on compiling that and being able to provide that to the public as soon as it has been finalized.
That's interesting only because Ethan said the testing is still continuing on the school levels earlier today.
And
assessments are not currently occurring.
So I said 2 seconds ago that I do know that assessments are occurring at the school-based level. I am unaware of what Ethan had said.
Obviously, it wasn't clear. I would have asked again.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. So I was unaware of what Ethan had said earlier. So if things have changed from when I spoke to him earlier this morning until right now, I wouldn't be able to speak to that. However, I can say that there were evaluations taking place this week at the Beethoven School as well as the Manning.
I will say I had a client who was evaluated at Madison. Mm-hmm. I don't know what I would encourage folks to approach, like this is how I approach this, which is that these are really challenging problems. I'm not an educator. I'm not a district administrator. I'm not a clinician. I do not know how to solve these problems. What I do know is that my client has a right to an evaluation within a particular time span. So to the extent that we can be creative and offer suggestions to the district and working with things, that's great. But I also think it's okay as a parent to just say, my kid needs to be evaluated. I requested it in June. I need you to figure something out. And I think that's an okay position to take as a parent. And we have 15 minutes left. So I'm going to keep us going. Evaluations are important and they're a big problem. So we're just going to talk briefly about this initial eligibility meeting. So now students been evaluated. First thing to know is you are entitled to the evaluations 2 days before the meeting. It's a good idea to ask for those. You should ask for translated materials and an interpreter if you need it. Please don't feel you do not have to bring your sibling or uncle or neighbor or therapist or whomever. It's Boston's job to provide an interpreter and Boston's job to translate materials. And so if you need that, please ask for it. Okay, how to prepare here. So my first suggestion is to think about your concerns. That's because one of the first questions that they should ask you at the meeting is, what are your concerns? So beforehand, if you want to write it down, that is helpful for me. Think about what are you worried about? Are you worried about your child academically, socially, emotionally? What is it that is worrying you? Read the evaluations if you're able to. Think about what you think your kid needs to be successful and write that down. So parents know their kids really well. So if you think about, when my kid is at home and I'm trying to get them to read, if I do this thing, that sometimes works. That is really valuable and schools should listen to that. At the meeting itself, ask questions. This is my number one piece of advice. Sometimes there's 15 people around the table and they all have a lot of letters after their names and they say a lot of things confidently and we don't know what they're talking about. Please ask. They're there to support you and your child and you are entitled to understand what is going on. So if someone says, well, they're in the 5th percentile and you're like, what's a percentile? Ask, what's a percentile? And if they give you an answer and you think nope, that still doesn't make sense to me, please keep asking. One thing that kills me is when I leave an IEP meeting with a client and they say, I didn't understand this thing. Folks should be able to understand everything that's happening. Please ask questions if you have them. Share your experience of your child's school. Is it the case? Sometimes you may have information that your kid's school doesn't have. And take a break if you need it, especially over Zoom. These meetings can be long and hard, and sometimes we all get tired, but we're not really done. It is perfectly reasonable to say, I need a break. I'm going to take a 5-minute break and then come back. Okay, we're going to move on. So I'm going to look at questions. So I'm going to go in reverse order here. So Latia wants to know, is the school required to provide evaluations 2 days before? They are required, but only if you ask. So you have to ask for the evaluations 2 days beforehand. And I should say too, that's 2 school days, not 2 calendar days. Jessica wants to know, Jessica, I'm not totally sure what your question is asking. Are you asking if there are, can you just can you restate your question in the chat for me? And okay, so Katie has a question about executive functioning sports. So executive functioning is really, again, not an educator, but basically executive functioning is the way in which we keep ideas organized in our heads. And sometimes we need support with that. So one question is an ADD or ADHD diagnosis required to access executive functioning sports? No. There's no sort of magic diagnosis that kicks you into magic supports. Everything is individualized. Is it true that an IEP is required to access executive functioning supports? No, but it is important to know that if you don't have an IEP or a 504 plan, you cannot hold the district accountable if they don't provide those executive functioning supports. So let's say, for example, that your child, like a pet died, and it's very hard on your kiddo. It would be very hard on me. And so that's really on your kid's brain, and it's making them a little distracted at school. And you think they're gonna need some extra support, checking in the morning and trying to make sure they know what their school day is supposed to look like. You could absolutely and should tell the school that's what's going on and ask for their help, and hopefully they'll work with you. But if they don't do it, they're not breaking the law. You don't have any way to hold them legally accountable. Okay, Jessica has a question about at-home ABA services. So that, I think, Jessica, tell me if this is right, you're saying that your child was getting in-person ABA services provided by Boston, and now Boston isn't providing those because the district has gone all remote. So you want to know if there's some way you can get your health insurance company to pay for those in-home private services. Assuming I've got that right. Certainly there are companies and organizations that do that, like TILL, T-I-L-L, and May are both providing in-home ABA services. However, I also think that there's an argument that Boston needs to be working to do that too, and we'll talk about that in about 5 minutes. Nicole. Nicole, I promise we are going to get to the independent eval. So then we have a question. Jessica, I hear you. ABA is Zoom only. That is very challenging. I completely agree. I do think there are some arguments that Boston ought to be providing those services in person, and we will get there. I could just line up these questions and that would be the rest of this training. Y'all are great. Executive functioning issues. Okay, the question is, could executive functioning issues qualify a student for an IEP? Sure. If, remember there are those, there's like the little arrow at the beginning of the presentation. So the question was, does the student have a disability? Is the student not making effective progress in school? Are they not making that progress because of their disability? Do they need some kind of special instruction or related services? So if those 4 questions are yes, then the student can qualify for an IEP. Yeah, Roxy also beautifully answered that. Thank you, Roxy. Okay, so I think out of time concerns, I was going to sort of talk about independent evaluations at the end, but I'm going to go ahead and do it now in the interest of time. So there've been a bunch of questions about what happens if someone outside of Boston evaluates your child. So here's how I think about this. There are basically 2 ways to get an evaluation paid for. One way is the district can pay for it. The other way is your health insurance can pay for it. So I think of these as district funded and health insurance funded. Sometimes people will call them outside evaluations and district funded evaluations. We're going to start with the district evaluations. So when we're thinking about initial eligibility, very beginning eligibility, the district sort of gets the first chance to evaluate your child. And then once the child is evaluated, the next, if that evaluation comes out and you read the evaluation and you think, I don't know what kid they evaluated, but it's not my kid, and this evaluation does not match what I know about my child, then you can say, I need an independent evaluation. And the way an independent evaluation works is that BPS, the district, is going to pay an independent evaluator, a person out there in the world, to evaluate your child. So that is what an independent evaluation is. Apart from that, there are also these outside evaluations that are funded by health insurance. And the outside evaluations are funded by your health insurance. So this is, places like MGH Sleep and the Brenner Center and Greater Neuropsych assessments of Greater Boston and so on. All of those places will do evaluations where you don't involve Boston at all. You can just call them and get on their list. Those lists are typically quite long. This is true for independent evaluations, which remember are district funded, and outside evaluations funded by your health insurance company. Okay. An important thing to know about independent evaluations and outside evaluations is that if you are feeling like your child really needs something and Boston doesn't agree, they don't think your child needs that, or they think your child needs something else, it's going to be very, very challenging for you to get a judge to order Boston to do that unless you have an evaluation that says that your child needs that thing. So I'm going to suggest that if your child is having a tough time in school, even if you're working with the school, which is great, I'm going to suggest that you try and get them on some waiting lists at somewhere like Children's or Tufts or MGH Leap, so that 6 months from now, if things aren't better, you have that evaluation. Now, I saw a question about independent evaluations and whether or not Boston can find someone eligible based just on the outside evaluation. So in non-pandemic times, not really. Now it's a little more complicated. The state has issued guidance where they encourage schools to review outside assessments, to review past data, to think about, do we really have to do these evaluations? Can we get it from somewhere else? So if you've got, let's say, for example, a 5-year-old autistic kid whom we're just not evaluating remotely, it's not happening, and there's some kind of health condition that means in-person services aren't happening, I would suggest trying to, especially if the district agrees, like, yes, the student has a disability, we just are having a hard time figuring out how to evaluate them. A thing that Boston certainly can do is provide your student with a 504 plan while you are waiting for an evaluation. That's one thing to ask for. And then I think this is a matter where I'm going to have one opinion, and there are folks in Boston who have a different opinion. I will tell you, I think that if you have an outside evaluation that says your student has a particular disability and Boston hasn't been able to evaluate them yet, that it is perfectly reasonable for you to argue that they should be found eligible during this extraordinary time because of this outside evaluation and past data that you have in the school. But that's a tough one. And if that's your situation, I'm going to encourage you to reach out to us. The rules are the same for charter schools. Yes, they are. Yes, evaluations are extremely expensive. One of the many, many, many ways our world is unjust is that if you can pay a lot of money, you can typically get an outside or independent evaluation very quickly. And if you don't have a lot of money, it's going to be a long time. But you can get them funded by Mass Health and funded by the district, but it is going to take longer, and that is deeply unfair. Charter schools are public schools, and they must honor IEPs and 504 plans. Roxy wants to point out that Ethan, who is in charge of special education for the district, has said that IEP teams should be taking independent evaluations into consideration. I will also say that even in non-pandemic times, if your kid has an independent evaluation, you should always bring that to the district, and the district must always review it, always. The only thing I'm talking about is a little bit iffy is as to whether we can get the district to find a child eligible for special education based on only an outside evaluation. I would argue yes. There are folks who would argue no. Yeah, Nicole, I'm for sure going to suggest that you shoot us an email or talk to folks in SpEdPAC. Okay. Okay, let's fly through this. SpEdPAC executive board folks in charge here. So what do you want me to do? We had planned to go through basically like what's in an IEP. I can go through what's in an IEP, or I can go to the end and talk about in-person/remote. I can try and do this like as fast as possible and then do in-person remote in 2 minutes. What do you want me to do?
Unless someone, and you can put it in the chat if you do, does someone have like some specific questions about the components of the actual IEP itself? So meaning like the sample document where she has page 1 and all these things, or, or even when you keep hearing on the media where they're saying, oh, the primary needs level, and that's on this page. What is that? It's a 1, a 2, a 3, and 4, but they never talked about it with you at your IEP meeting. So I want to see a sample. I hate that we have to take
Okay. I'm just gonna breathe. I'm gonna do it as fast as I can where it is still being useful. Okay, so we're gonna start the first page of an IEP. This is like the big picture. We're gonna start with your concerns, the family's concerns. Then we're gonna talk about what are the students' strengths. So sometimes a huge bummer about the way the system is set up is that you sort of have to say, here are all the things that my child has a hard time with in order to get support. That's not great. That's a terrible way to write a law. So we want to say like, what are students' strengths? And then a vision statement. Sometimes folks breeze through this, but I think it is helpful to think about like, what do you want? Like really, what do you want? What does your kid really want? So that you can keep that in mind so you have a sense of what you are working for. Okay. What I'm going to do so folks in the chat don't feel sort of left out, I'm going to go through this whole thing and then we're going to look at questions. So after we go through the big picture, we're going to go to what we call present levels of educational performance A. People call it PLEP A because everything has to have an acronym. PLEP A says, how does the student's disability affect their sort of work in school? So the first thing is, you can see right there, it says Does the student's disability affect them in English language arts, history and social sciences, science and technology, math, other curriculum areas, maybe like music, for example, or art or something. This is, somebody asked, can an IEP cover multiple content areas? Here's where you would indicate that the student's disability affects them in multiple content areas. The next part says, how does the disability affect progress in the curriculum areas? So this is where you say, okay, what does the student's disability look like? So maybe it looks like you tell them to write a paragraph and they tell you to go to hell because they hate writing. Or maybe it looks like you hand them a math problem and they work at it for a really long time, but are just so confused. Those are some of the ways that a disability might affect a student. And then the next part says, what types of accommodations does a student need in order to make progress? So remember, we talked about IEPs are a free and appropriate public education, which include specially designed instruction. How are we going to teach this student? Accommodations, what do we need to change in order to make sure the student is successful? And related services, what extra services do kids need? So this is where we're saying, all right, here are the accommodations that this student needs. Remember, that's things like extra time or preferential seating, or they need a fidget spinner or things like that. The next part asks for specially designed instruction. So this is where we talk about this student needs a special education teacher to come in and support them during math, or this student needs a small group reading program, or something like that. That's PLEP A. PLEP B, same idea, except PLEP B recognizes there are a lot of things kids learn in school that aren't reading, writing, and arithmetic. So this is all of those other things. This is things like, what about extracurriculars or social emotional needs? Or maybe we've got a student with who really needs to learn how to use the teeth, maybe not during a pandemic, but pre-pandemic. Or we have a student who needs assistive technology in order to communicate. This is all of those other areas. And then it asks the same questions. How does the disability affect the student? What types of accommodations does the student need? And lastly, what kind of specially designed instruction do they need to make progress? Okay, next we're going to talk about goals. Goals are, I think, a challenging part of an IEP because they're really supposed to be objective and measurable. So this is how we know, means you know if your kid is making progress. You for sure know. You know and your kid knows, but we need some way to prove it. And this is a way that we are able to prove it. An important thing to keep in mind about goals is they are not about measuring your kid or the student. They are about measuring the school. These goals say, okay, if we provide the services that we say we will provide and the accommodations and the specially designed instruction, then I think this student should be able to accomplish this particular thing by the end of this year. And if they can't, then that means we, the school, have done something wrong. There's some problem. We were wrong. And so it's important to remember this is really about measuring the school. It's not about like making sure the student can do it. It's important that goals be, sometimes schools write something like a student will be able to, a student will raise their hand like 80% of the time that they want to speak. That's, it's going to be challenging for a teacher to keep track of every time the child wants to speak and how often they raise their hand. So we want to try and think about goals that there's actually going to be data around, that it actually seems like we can measure. Okay, I'm going to answer these couple questions here. Okay. Goals are set in the initial eligibility meeting, and then every year there's an annual review where the IEP team, remember that's you, providers, your kid's school, maybe your child, depending on their age, and they think about, okay, have the student been able to meet their goals? If not, why not? What do we need to change? If so, then let's push the goals higher. Let's push the student further. Let's push ourselves further. So goals are set in the initial meeting and then reviewed every year thereafter. So if a school is often bringing up the fact that a student is struggling with behavior problems, should the school provide ABA services? The school should certainly do something. I don't know that it's necessarily ABA. Sometimes that's what kids need. Sometimes it's not. I had a kid who just really needed like a weighted blanket. It depends on the individual student. If I will say that sometimes we see situations where schools are sort of constantly saying that they're concerned about a student's behavior. It's important to remind the school that that's what they're there to work on. That's a huge part of being a school. And that if a student is repeatedly having some kind of behavioral challenge, the school needs to reconvene the IEP team, think about reevaluating the student, and figure out what that student needs in order to be successful. Okay, so then there's a question of what if an independent evaluation says something different than the school and you agree with the independent evaluator? That is the very last slide, is what to do when you and your school disagree, which I'm gonna do. Okay, I'm gonna pause on these questions to see what more we can get through, but Peggy, Eileen, I will get there. Actually, I'll just say real quickly, Eileen, every 3 years, the district needs to do a reevaluation, but a parent can always ask for an evaluation sooner than that. Okay. I think we'll just go through the grid, though my images aren't working here, but I'm mindful of time. I will just say that the service grid, which for some reason is not showing up, but the service grid is one of the pages at the end, and it says, it lists 3 different charts. The first chart are people who are going to help the students, providers. So this is where we list out people who are going to help not the student directly, but the student's teachers. So for example, maybe your child doesn't need occupational therapy directly, but it's really helpful for them to have occupational therapy tools built into their day. So we're gonna have an occupational therapist work with your child's teacher in order to build those occupational therapy tools into their day. So that's grid A, are those consults is what they're called, but basically helping the students' teachers. Grid B, this is services in the general education or inclusion classroom. So this is like if you have a student who is getting what's sometimes called push-in support. So a special education teacher comes and hangs out in the classroom during math to help a particular student. That would be in grid B. Or maybe a counselor comes by and works with a group of students on social skills in the classroom. Those would go in grid B. And grid C are services outside of the general education classroom. So if you have a student who is in one of those substantially separate classrooms, the smaller classrooms, or is in a day school or a residential school, you're going to see all the services in the third grid, grid C. And I'm so sorry that I don't have that image there. Keep on going. And then I think at this point, I think I'm actually just going to breeze through this slide for time. Peggy, I will answer your question about what happens for students who age out of special education at 22. Kids age out of special education at 22. And you're saying, what about when parents want the district to provide daily living skills? That should be part of a student's IEP that a student should be able to continue to provide. So if a student has a disability where they need daily living skills, that would for sure be part of PLEP B, that second page that we saw, and the district should be providing those. When we talk about how to respond, An important thing to know is sometimes I talk to parents who say, I wouldn't sign the IEP. It's important to always sign, but you don't have to agree. We think if we sign, we agree. No, you can disagree, and you should if you don't agree, but you should sign to indicate that you disagree. So you can either say that you accept the IEP, all of it. You can say you reject the IEP, all of it. Or you can say, I reject certain parts of the IEP. So for example, let's say that you want your child to be in an inclusion classroom and the district proposes placing your student in a substantially separate classroom. You could check the box that says you're going to partially reject it. And you could say, I reject this IEP to the extent it places my child in a substantially separate classroom. That's how that works. And you can always accept the IEP, but reject the placement. Okay. So we do not have time to go through all of COVID compensatory services, unfortunately. Probably as the year goes on, we should come back and do a whole shtick on this. But I will basically say that this is to protect kids who have lost a lot of learning over the last 7-8 months. And a really important thing to know is that if your student is in this group of kids that Boston sometimes calls high needs or sometimes calls high priority for in-person learning, the state calls them kids with complex and significant needs. So it's three things. They all mean the same thing: high needs, complex and significant needs, high priority for in-person learning. If your child falls into that category, Boston needs to hold a meeting to develop a plan to get your child caught up from everything they have missed by December 15th. If you're worried about this for your child, if you feel like they've lost a lot, I'm going to encourage you to today, right now, maybe not literally right now, but today, to request a COVID compensatory services meeting with your school. And then we're just going to fly through the rest of this. One other thing that's helpful to know about in-person and remote learning is to ask your school for a COVID service delivery plan. This is something that the state gave to districts, and it says you, school, should write up so that a parent knows how, why, and where services will be delivered. So for example, back when Boston was more regularly in person, saying your child will get occupational therapy every Tuesday in person, or your child will get occupational therapy every Thursday remotely, or your child will get this extra math support at this time. Those kinds of information. You should ask your school for a COVID service delivery plan. Does not require a signature. It's not like an IEP amendment. It's just the school sort of trying to help everybody stay on the same page about what's going on. Okay, I want to briefly talk about in-person learning. So the state has said that even if schools are closed, schools must make every effort to provide high needs kids with in-person learning at school, at home, or in the community. So I think that what that means is that although there are many complications with Boston trying to provide in-person learning to kids, I think that what that means is that when there are students who need in-person learning or they can't access a free and appropriate public education, they can't access school, Boston needs to figure out a way to provide those students with in-person learning, whether at a school building, at a Boys and Girls Club, or a Y, or at home. So if you want in-person learning right now, I know Boston is closed. Here's what I'm going to suggest. Number one, if you can, try and keep a journal about how your kiddo is doing on a day-to-day basis. Did they log on to remote learning today? Could they do the work? Any kind of record that you can create is going to be helpful for your school and for you later on to see how a student is doing. Step number two, look at Boston's high needs list and think about, does your child fit into one of those categories? Again, I know that is a terrible way to think about kids. Does your child fit into one of those categories? I'll also say one category that's on the state's list that is not on Boston's list is the state says that your child should be prioritized for in-person learning if your child cannot engage in remote learning because of their disabilities. That's it. So just if your kid couldn't engage in remote learning because of their disabilities, that means the state says your child should be prioritized for in-person learning. So that's step 2. I will say, Nicole, the list is about 2 slides before this, but I breezed through it, so it will be on the slides. Step number 3 is call the school or talk to a teacher, whomever you have a good relationship with in your school, and explain what's going on and that you think your kid needs some kind of in-person learning. If that doesn't work, please call us. Roxy, do you want to talk about this real quick? Or do you want me to?
You know, you're such a dynamic duo. Go for it.
Okay. So we're trying to figure out what we can do on a sort of more systemic basis to try and help kids who need in-person learning in Boston get in-person learning. So if you have a child who you think needs in-person learning and you can't get it right now, if you're comfortable, would you put your email address or ideally email address, I was gonna say, or phone number, but you might not want to do that. At least your email address in the chat, and we are going to pull together a group of folks to talk about that sometime next week. So we can try and work on those issues. Okay. Last thing I'm going to say is if you disagree with the district about something, which happens, schools and families disagree, that's why I have a job. There's 2 things you can do, really. One is the Bureau of Special Education Appeals. The Bureau of Special Education Appeals deals with only special education problems. They're sort of like fake court. That's how I think about it. BSEA mediations, the number is right there. You can call a BSEA to schedule a mediation. We just did a section about mediation, so I won't repeat it here. But the thing to know about mediation is that you for sure do not need a lawyer. You can do it on your own, and the mediator for Boston is great. So if you're having a special education problem, a great way to handle it is going through a BSEA mediation. If that doesn't work and you think you need a hearing, I'm going to suggest you give us a call so we can see if we can figure out a way to help. You can also file all kinds of education-related complaints with the state problem resolution system. This is not like fake court. It is not a hearing. It is all done over paper, and you can file online, and it is in a whole bunch of different languages. You can do this for a whole bunch of reasons. You can do it because you think your child was restrained and you weren't told about it, because your child was sent home. You could do it because your child wasn't getting a service that they were supposed to get. It doesn't have to be just special ed. Any kind of education-related complaint can go to the problem resolution system. And now, you know, I really pride myself on being on time with things, and we are 20 minutes over, which is just atrocious. I'm sorry, folks. And then my contact information is, I'll just pull this up here. Please know that if you call us and you're not a current client and you're not calling about a current client, it may take us up to 2 business days to call you back, but I promise we will call you back. And I will hang out for another second and see if anybody has any other questions.
No, thank you very much, Elizabeth McIntyre. We appreciate you and Greater Boston Legal Services allowing you to be here with us tonight. This has been extremely helpful. Brian, thank you also for being here to be able to answer those BBX questions and hanging all the way to the end, because we appreciate that. You know, we are a community that understands that sometimes it may take a little longer and there'll be different things, but we're going to make sure that all of our families get the information. As a reminder, all the information will be available on our website. Give us about a week, but we will post the video on our website and also on our YouTube channel. And the handouts will also be posted on our website, so you can also download those. I have to get the handouts from our October 17th meeting, but those will be posted shortly, and that video is coming up soon. So thank you all for your patience, for joining us. Any family where we had trouble with the translation issues, please know that, just let us know. Our channel, the channel didn't work, and we'll work with BPS to get it translated into your language so you can hear that, because I know there were still some channels that did not allow us to work with translation. And please do think about what Elizabeth said too, because with systemic advocacy, we really need to look at our high needs students and who needs to be and who wants to be in-person learning. If you're looking to work with them and to do that, and you have a child that needs in-person learning, you want to work with them, we will share those emails with her, because then it becomes private, and then her group will talk to you about what are some options available based on different circumstances. So thank you all for hanging in there with us. We appreciate every single one of you, and we ask you to have a great night. And as always, I thank all my fellow SpEdPAC board members that are here too, because behind the scenes, they do so much work to ensure that this can be done. So thank you all, and have a great night.
Thank you so much for having me. Take care, folks.